People, we've been seeing for some time the secret symbolism and occult references embedded within pop culture, the music industry, and the Hollywood machine, and today we're going to dive even deeper into these things hidden beneath the surface in some of the most popular films and franchises of our time. And what better guest to point out the subtle nods to secret societies and the ancient archetypes and rituals referenced within these movies than a 32nd degree Mason himself. Back in the THC saddle for another wild ride is returning guest Robert W. Sullivan IV. Robert is a philosopher, scholar, historian, and author of two great books, one of which we discussed in our last show called The Royal Ark of Enoch, The Impact of Masonic Ritual, Philosophy, and Symbolism, and his latest, which we're going to talk about today, Cinema Symbolism, a guide to the esoteric imagery in popular movies. If you thought Hollywood was unoriginal before, just wait. It's one of my favorite topics, and I'm psyched to dive into it. Robert, my man, welcome to THC. How are you?
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me on the HighersideChats for round number 2. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate you having me back on. Thank you.
Oh, no problem, man. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to do it as well. It's always great to talk to you. I had a great time on the last show we did. I really think this one's going to be even better because you picked some great movies to analyze in this book with a depth that I can't say I've seen anywhere else, so it's going to be awesome. But I'm a bit curious, man. You've been a Mason since 1997, and I'm sure you've noticed some of this stuff before, but once you started going through a lot of these rituals and studying the sacred knowledge yourself, was it at all surprising to find out just how much of this stuff comes up in Hollywood movies?
It was a bit surprising to an extent. I think for me, I think one of the real great tip-offs for me with this was when I saw the first National Treasure movie, which came out, I want to say about 10 years ago. I mean, I can't believe it's been that long now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. But this was right when I was still working on Royal Arch of Enoch. And when I watched that, I mean, it's like, oh, my God, there's the Royal Arch ceremonial surrounded by all these Masonic symbolisms, the recovery of the treasure of Freemasonry beneath, in the subterranean vault beneath the Holy Ground. So then, and I kind of picked up on some of these themes before, things like with being there. And this was really some of the material I incorporated in the final chapter of the Royal Arch. But then, like, you're right. I mean, as you continue to plow away with this material and you continue to do research, you will definitely find this stuff turning up in these popular movies. I mean, and it is without question, you're beyond the coincidence level when you see it over and over again. These themes, the archetypes, the mythology, the numerology, things like that. So just to give your listeners just real quick, when I was writing Royal Arch, I kind of brought the Royal Arch of Enoch book up to modern day. The last chapter's about Masonic, Enochian, solar themes in movies. But there was this whole boatload of films that I wanted to talk about that had these same themes in it. And obviously, I couldn't have a 400-page chapter in Royal Arch of Enoch. So when I finished Royal Arch, I started writing this book that we're talking about today called Cinema Symbolism, which I talk about. I go further into detail, not necessarily Masonic themes, although some are, with this deep arcana, esoterica embedded in popular movies. But yes, being a Freemason certainly helps, and definitely studying this mysticism. And for the last 20 years, I basically took the knowledge that I applied to Royal Arch and placed it and put it on Hollywood, and it's without question that this material is clearly being used by Hollywood producers and directors to convey hidden meanings, to embed their movies with this ancient mythology. This is going on, no doubt about it.
Yeah, man, it's super fascinating the more and more you look at it, and I'm always shocked to hear an analysis of a new movie, and to have so many in your book right in a row is just awesome. So let's talk about a couple of these movies. Let's talk Back to the Future. I think this is one of the less obvious ones. I had no idea there was so much attention to detail and so much meaning behind the times and dates and all kinds of stuff used in the movie. It's pretty impressive. Can you tell the people a little bit about some of the things you found?
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right, and this kind of goes into your first question a little bit. For me, finding this material in movies, there is always, finding it in movies that you kind of least expected it is really interesting, and the Back to the Future one is really overwrought with imagery and esoteric symbolism. But like you're right, on cursory glance you wouldn't notice it. But for lack of a better term, you have a lot of Egyptian mythology going on in the Back to the Future trilogy. You have the concept of the solar family, which is the McFly family, which would be Osiris, Isis, and Horus would be the sun child. And of course, George McFly would correspond to the Osiris archetype, who is the father who is killed and resurrected. And of course, this happens in part 2. 2, where he's murdered and brought back to life. And then you have the virginal mother figure, who is Lorraine. And then, of course, they are coveted or battle against. In Egyptian mythology, this would be the Set or Seth character, darkness personified, who is known within Greek mythology as Typhon. This turns up as Biff Tannen. The name Typhon and Tannen are all but phonetically exactly the same. And of course, as the solar family, the McFlys reside in lion estates, and this is, of course, a reference to Leo the lion, which is the house of the zodiac, which is ruled by the sun. And then you've got the Doc Brown character, who is sort of the hermetic Hermes Trismegistus wizard-like character. And I want your listeners to understand I am kind of going over a lot of material here. I mean, I know we're limited in time, so if you want more detail, please read the book. But obviously, you have the Doc Brown character corresponding to the is surrounded by the number 5, developing the flux capacitor on November 5th, 1955. This corresponds to the 5th card of the Tarot, known as the Hierophant. This is the manipulator of time and space. You read the earmarks of this card, and especially Crowley's take on it. I mean, Crowley put an Egyptian spin on it, which is very apropos for this movie. Crowley said the Hierophant is the master and manipulator of time and space. So this, of course, corresponds to the Doc Brown character, who, of course, is the inventor of the time machine. He is, by default, the master of space-time. Then, of course, you have the little dog Einstein becoming the world's first time traveler at 1:21 a.m. 1:21 is a reference to the 1.21 gigawatts of electricity needed to fire the flux capacitor. One of the real unique solar attributes that is really very uniquely veiled in the movie is the date that the time machine is activated at 10:04 p.m. This is drilled into your head in the first movie. 10:04 is a reference to the date of October 4th, which I want to say is the 276th day of the year, which means there are exactly 88 days left in the year. This is a solar reference. And of course, 88 is the number that needs to be reached to activate the solar chariot that the sun child drives. And of course, the lightning strikes the clock tower at exactly 10:04, investing the chariot with the energy of the sun, and allows the DeLorean to break the space-time continuum. Of course, this is basically, I get into it much more depth into the book, but it's basically transforming the DeLorean into the sun chariot of Hebrew mysticism of the Maise Merkaba. It's very deep material. But again, you'll find this in Back to the Future. The Biff Tannen character is Typhon, the enemy of the sun, and of course he kills Osiris or George McFly in Part 2. And George McFly is resurrected by his son, and assisted by the mother Isis, the virginal archetype there. So you find that in Part 2. And then in Part 2 also, the older Biff Tannen character drives around in a taxi cab, identified as the Luxor taxi cab. And again, this is another Egyptian reference there. So yeah, just Back to the Future trilogy swells with Egyptian mythology. But I mean, Back to the Future, I want to say it's either chapter 3 or 4 in the book, and it's probably one of my all-time favorite chapters in the book, because it's a string of movies that people are kind of familiar with. Star Wars with the monomyth, and the Matrix with Gnosticism, but the Egyptian motifs going on in the Back to the Future trilogy is pretty well unknown. My book is really one of the first ones to document it. I mean, there's some other esoteric references going on in that movie with buildings being placed. The building in one time frame has a dualistic meaning in another time frame. Like in 1985, the building may be something that it's different in 2015. Usually they're the polar opposite. This ties into concepts of dualism, Gnosticism as well. So yeah, I mean, just a ton going on in the Back to the Future movies, and it's probably one of my favorite chapters of the book, because you're right, it's one of those string of movies where it's overloaded with esoteric symbolism, but it's a string of movies that you really wouldn't expect to find it in.
Yeah. Wow, you just hit us with so much. And one part that was kind of interesting is when you're talking about Biff becoming Typhon in the second film. He gets the sports almanac, and he gets all the insider information for the next so many years. It's funny because someone might not think that or might not make the connection to that reference of Typhon, but there's a scene where there's a video, I guess it's a porn video, sitting on his bar, and it's called Black Taboo, which is almost the same as black magic, which is bringing up that kind of esoteric thing in the back of people's minds. It's making that connection right there by placing a video at that title in the frame. I thought that was kind of interesting, an interesting detail.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll find these little details placed throughout these films in general, but Back to the Future, the trilogy does a really great job with it. Right, you have the Typhon character being sort of the, master of black magic, and that's exactly what Biff Tannen does. People just, kind of goes by people, but if you really think about it, he's invested with forbidden knowledge of the future, and he uses it. He basically uses time as a black magic device to create this wealthy empire, which is completely corrupt. It's completely evil. And that's exactly what Biff Tannen becomes. And you're right, you'll see the little video, Black Taboo, referencing black magic, behind him. And this is at the top of the casino hotel in part 2. Also, that's really unique, and this is another little attention to detail going on in that movie, is when Marty McFly goes into the Biff Tannen Museum, he's greeted by the wax figure of Biff Tannen. And playing in the background on the video screen is a reference to the ancestor, Mad Dog Tannen, who's the villain in Part 3, who is, of course, the ancestor. And it's told that Mad Dog Tannen killed, it's revealed in the movie that Mad Dog killed Doc Brown over a horseshoe incident. And if you pay attention to that scene, the wax figure of Biff Tannen is actually holding up a horseshoe, sort of metaphorically anticipating the events of Part 3. So you're correct, Greg. You'll find these very hidden nuances and symbolism going on, and it'll just be passed over very briefly, but they are very adroitly placed, and they are definitely intentionally placed there. There's no question about it.
Yeah. One other example that I wanted to touch on that I thought was pretty interesting in the Back to the Future movies is in Part 2, George McFly's tombstone has a date selected for a very specific reason. It's actually a reference to the Fool Tarot card, right?
That's absolutely correct. What I talk about in the book, one of the overarching themes, no pun intended, with cinema symbolism was talking about the Jungian archetypes, coming off of tarot cards. This ties into the idea of the collective unconscious. You're correct, the George McFly character, father, corresponds almost perfectly to the emblems of the Fool Tarot card. And you'll find if you watch, sort of the loner recluse who's very imaginative and sort of, eccentric, and this is sort of the George McFly, but all he wants to do is he produces the great work, the science fiction work, which turns him into a famous author, but he's sort of a basket case, in high school, kind of the loner type. And this, of course, corresponds exactly to the Fool archetype within the tarot cards. But yeah, if you watch Part 2, that's right, it's George McFly's birthday is April 1st, which is April Fool's, of course. And this is the Fool card, April Fool's, of course, and a reference to the Fool card from the major arcana of the tarot. And I talk about this in the book, certain characters who are living and breathing tarot cards. George McFly is one of them. He is the Fool card, straight out of the major arcana. And you'll find this in cinema, the living and breathing tarot card. And you're correct, Greg, George McFly is definitely one of them.
Yeah, it's so fun to analyze those archetypes and realize just how many times they're reused and just so recognizable. Another movie to move on that you analyzed that I loved the breakdown of was The Wizard of Oz, because I had heard before that it was deep symbolism for money and the financial system, but I'd never heard the real details and with the political context of its time, which you also add in. Can you break that one down for us a little bit? It's probably one of the more interesting ones to me.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. You're going to have to give me a little time here, and if I start dragging on, please feel free to interrupt me.
Oh, absolutely. Take your time.
Really, with The Wizard of Oz, you have 3 layers of symbolism going on. And let me point out to your listeners that the author of The Wizard of Oz was a man named L. Frank Baum, who was a member of Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy Society. So, some people, you hear the naysayers say, oh, well, these people would have no knowledge of this. This is all just one giant coincidence. That's bull. These authors, these movie makers are very in tune with this material. And again, it's intentionally placed. based. I have little doubt about that. Sometimes, of course, it can be coincidence. That's always, there's an exception to every rule. But the argument that, oh, these guys had never heard of this, or this is all just one giant coincidence, that argument falls flat on its face. L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, was a member of Theosophy. His wife was too. They were very well versed in this esoterica. And if your listeners aren't familiar, I'm sure they are, but make a long story real short, Blavatsky's Theosophy movement was basically neo-Gnosticism, to make a long story real short. But you have in The Wizard of Oz these three levels of symbolism going on. One is, and they're all present, one is, of course, that this is just a mere adventure about a girl who gets whisked away to a magical land, has an adventure, goes home, story over, have a nice day. This is what Albert Pike would call the explanation for the profane masses. This is, nonsense, of course. This is just your profane explanation, to use Albert Pike's words. Then you have the political allegory going on, and I'm going to try to segregate them out, but they do overlap to a bit of an extent. You have the entire political allegory going on within The Wizard of Oz, and you have to be cognizant of The Wizard of Oz, essentially one gigantic political, economic, socio-allegory of the United States of America from around 1896 to around 1900, where you had things going on such as the free silver movement, which was the gold standard only being applied to silver, which was instead of using gold to back paper money, you were using silver. You had the Depression of 1896, where laborers and farmers were undergoing foreclosure. Laborers were being laid off in droves. You had the President of the United States, William McKinley, who was also a Freemason, basically defeating the Democratic and the socialist challengers with ease. Those were Williams Jennings Bryan and Eugene Debs. And you had McKinley, who wanted to use the gold standard to back paper money. And this is what you have going on in The Wizard of Oz. You have the yellow brick road is the gold standard leading to Emerald City, which is green, which is symbolizing the paper money, the printing of United States currency. And of course, The Wizard of Oz is none other than President William McKinley, the Masonic president. McKinley was number 25. It's interesting, if you watch the movie, when Scarecrow at the end gets the brain, gets the diploma, and McKinley, the Wizard of Oz, invests the Scarecrow with, quote unquote wisdom. What is the Wizard of Oz, or what does the Scarecrow do? He recites back to the wizard the 47th proposition of Euclid: a squared plus b squared equals c squared, which is actually the emblem of a Masonic worshipful master. So you'll find that little Masonic reference going on in the movie. And then you have things like, the Cowardly Lion, who is all roar but no bite. This would represent or symbolize Eugene Debs and William Jennings Bryan. You have the Wicked Witch of the West, who is green-skinned. This would represent paper money, the negative side of paper money, which would be inflation. You have the Scarecrow, who is, of course, the farmer, the American farmer, who joins with the Tin Man, who is the American laborer. And you'll notice in the film that the laborer, the Tin Man, is immobile. He can't move. And again, this is symbolizing the Depression of 1896, which saw American laborers being laid off in droves. However, he gets moving again. He gets, symbolically back to work by being oiled up. And this is symbolic of the oil companies, of people like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller Standard Oil, who put a lot of the laborers back to work. So thus the Tin Man gets mobile again by being oiled up or being put back to work by the American oil companies. And then other political allegories, you'll have the little two dancing troops at the beginning, the Lullaby League, who are the sleeping yet awakening women's movement, and then the Lollipop Guild, who is unionized labor. This was coming into effect under the McKinley administration. So you'll have this entire gigantic political allegory going on with The Wizard of Oz. I detail it much more in the book. And then again, you'll have the tornado, which symbolizes foreclosure of the farm, taking the farm away somewhere else. So you have that entire allegory going on within The Wizard of Oz. But then you have this very deeper Gnostic theme going on in The Wizard of Oz. And again, this ties into Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy movement, neo-Gnosticism, which of course Baum was a member of, where you have the initiatic experience, Dorothy Gale undergoing initiation into the mysteries, receiving gnosis or enlightenment, which for her is self-revelation, epiphany, where she realizes for her epiphany is that there's no place like home. And of course, she's whisked away in a tornado, representing the winding staircase of the mysteries, the winding staircase of the second degree of Freemasonry, known as, the middle chamber of King Solomon's temple. This would be the ladder of Mithras in the Mithraic mysteries, where you ascend and descend to gain esoteric wisdom. So Dorothy essentially ascends the ladder, where she's taken away to this magical land. She travels on the golden path of enlightenment, but of course the golden path of religion leads to the false messiah, the demiurge, known to the Gnostics, the lesser material god, which of course is the Wizard of Oz, who is nothing but a windbag, a phony, which is ultimately exposed by the little dog, who sort of serves as Dorothy Gale's little familiar. A familiar is sort of an animal who assists witches on errands. And of course, I'm not saying Dorothy Gale is a witch, but of course the little dog acts like a little familiar, I guess is the way for me to describe it, and exposes the wizard as a fraud. And of course, Blavatsky talked about that in order to receive gnosis and initiation into the mysteries, one must have a brain, one must have a heart, and one must have courage. Thus, Dorothy Gale has three sojourners who seek a wisdom, fortitude, and courage. That's the symbology of there. And of course, the wizard, once exposed, and this was, of course, the fear of all religions, that it leads to a false messiah. And this is symbolized at the end, where the false messiah takes Dorothy back to Kansas after she receives her epiphany in a hot air balloon, symbolizing that all religion is nothing but hot air, and that the divine spark lies within you. And then again, this is for Dorothy Gale to discover on her own, that for her epiphany is there's no place like home. And it's interesting also that Baum also incorporates this with the witches of Oz. The two witches, this is in the book, it's also in the movie. In the book, there's two witches of the north and south. In the movie, it's only one, Glinda of the south. And of course, Glinda's wand is tipped with the pentagram with 1 point up, 2 points down, symbolizing the white kabbalistic magic. But in the book, it's the two witches, and it's north and south movement. This is how one receives Ascensio, by moving north and south up the ladder of initiation, the ladder of Mithras, the winding staircase of Freemasonry. The two women who use the black magic are of the east and west in Oz, and this symbolizes stagnation. One does not move up and down or receive gnosis by moving left and right or west and east. One receives gnosis by moving upwards up the ladder of enlightenment. So thus, the two black magicians of Oz are of the east and west, while the two white magicians are of the north and south, symbolizing sublime gnosis. So you'll find this entire Gnostic religion, initiation into the mysteries, going on inside the Wizard of Oz also, and I document it much more in the book. So really, and again, you'll find at the end where Dorothy wakes up from her adventure in Kansas, having undergone this initiatic experience, and of course no one else understands her. They're now the profane masses, again to quote Albert Pike. But you have, again, this entire theosophy, gnosis, Gnostic initiation symbology going on in the Wizard of Oz, combined with the political allegory. It's fascinating. It's very layered. You're hitting on some of my favorite chapters, but Wizard of Oz is just overloaded with esoteric imagery, three levels of symbology going on, and the political and the esoteric are very fascinating studies.
Yeah, man. Boom. You really know your stuff.
Well, I looked at this for 20 years, Greg, and, like I said, I want your listeners to understand that basically the Royal Arch of Enoch was 20 years of studying this stuff, and what I did was I really took the 20 years of study and applied it to movies, and then hence Cinema Symbolism was born out of that, and it's really a continuation of the final chapter of the Royal Arch of Enoch.
Yeah, man, it's super interesting to me. And I'd say of all those layers in The Wizard of Oz, the theme that I find most fascinating is that the theme of the symbolism of financial systems and currencies, and the fact that the movie is so focused on wizardry, because to me, money is wizardry. We talked a little bit about alchemy lately on the show, and I see the whole fractional reserve banking system as alchemy. I mean, these banking families have created unlimited wealth for themselves out of essentially nothing, casting a spell over the whole world to worship the green paper they print. I mean, that's magical, man. That's alchemy to me.
Yeah, that's certainly one way of looking at it, is the concept of creation of wealth out of nothing. It's like a credit card. It's not real money. You really never see it. It's just you're paying back interest, which kind of is seen. So yeah, I mean, it is a form of alchemy, and you're right. What's the entire purpose of alchemy is the transmutation of base metal into gold, and gold is the gold standard, which is the underlying basis for financial systems. So, and you've got the wizard there, the master, the phony master of all this in Oz. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a political allegory. And it's funny you bring up alchemy because, just to give a brief preview, I'm writing Cinema Symbolism 2 right now, and alchemy I'm finding is a very dominant theme in movies. I touch on it a little bit in Cinema Symbolism, but a lot of themes are very alchemical in nature. And what I'm talking about is not necessarily, movies about people turning base metal into gold, although Goldfinger, the James Bond movie, is really the godfather of that. But movies about transition of the self, things like that, which is very alchemical. Alchemy is a very popular flavor in Hollywood.
There's just so much to The Wizard of Oz, but another interesting detail that's a little racy that I guess comes out a lot more in the book than in the movie, but as far as the breakdown of what the different characters represent, the flying monkeys in the story are supposed to symbolize Native Americans in some way. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's right. If you read the book, it's more known in the book than it is in the movie. Who are sort of the subservients to the Wicked Witch, and this could you could also ultimately tie in that the American Indians are subservient. The Wicked Witch being the negative representation of money, that the monkeys are sort of subservient to the United States of America is one way of looking at it. But if you read the book, it becomes clear that the flying monkeys are symbolic of Native Americans. They talk about how the flying monkeys once ruled the land of Oz, carefree, did whatever they wanted, but then they were ultimately taken away and other people moved in and then basically became sort of indentured servants to a higher master, which of course is basically what Native Americans were. They once ruled the land and now are basically placed on reservations and, for lack of a better word, had all their lands taken away. And Baum makes this clear in the book that the flying monkeys are allegorically the Native Americans who had their lands taken away. The monkeys did too. But yeah, it's something I touch on Cinema Symbolism. It's a theme you'll find in The Shining also by Stanley Kubrick. The whole concept of the Overlook Hotel representing the United States of America being built on Indian burial ground, symbolizing the United States burying the Native American nations. That's a study I'm taking on much more in Cinema Symbolism too.
Man, it's just so interesting how calculated these details are. You think something as random as a name is just like picked out of the ether, but no, that's definitely by design. I mean, even you talked a little bit about the political allegory and the presidential representation, but also Dorothy. It's the name Dorothy, Dorothy, is Theodore backwards, which is a reference to Theodore Roosevelt, right?
Well, that's right. You have at the end of the movie basically McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, the common man, Dorothy as sort of the representation of the common person, the common American. I mean, of course, this was exactly what, again, this ties into the political allegory. This was exactly what Theodore Roosevelt was trying to embrace, the common man, the progressive movement, things like that, which Theodore Roosevelt was all about. So you have Dorothy Gale as a representation of Theodore Roosevelt as well. And you're right, Dorothy is a palindrome. Dorothy backwards is Theodore, symbolizing Theodore Roosevelt. And even the name Toto, the little dog, is a reference to teetotaling, not drinking, which is an esoteric reference to Williams Jennings Bryan, the Democratic challenger to Roosevelt and McKinley, who lost both times in 1896 and 1901, and again personified in the Cowardly Lion. So yeah, names backwards, forwards can also be involved with this. The attention to detail is astonishing. And that's one of the tip-offs that this stuff is very intentionally done. If you were to see it once or twice, you could kind of chalk this up as, maybe it's a coincidence. But when you see this stuff over and over again, yeah, you're beyond the coincidence phase.
You also mentioned something that I had totally forgotten about, and that is the urban legend that if you play Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon with Wizard of Oz on mute, the movie and the album sync up pretty well. And I actually have done this. I did it when I was like 16 or 17. I went to Best Buy and bought both of them. And I would say that it isn't perfect, but it's got enough moments to really make one wonder if this is just like an expression of the muse within two separate but both masterful pieces of art, or coincidence, or something more. And it is intriguing, though, if you're into that kind of thing. I'm sure now you can find it on YouTube where someone's already synced it up, but it's worth a look.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. I have met people, I'm 50-50 on it. For starters, I've never tried the experiment. I talk about it in the book, but I've met people who swear on everything holy that it works. Alternatively, I've met people who have said, oh, it doesn't work, I've tried it. It's supposed to work, and of course, this is no state secret, that if you've done it correctly, that the song Money will cue up immediately when Dorothy opens the door and Oz is there in color.
Yep.
It's the transition to black and white to color, and that it's supposed to sync perfectly with Money, but like I said, I've never tried it, and I've talked to people who swear it works perfectly, and other people who say, oh, it doesn't work at all. But it's the Pink Floyd album we're talking about, obviously, and people can try it if they want to. It's Dark Side of the Moon. It's supposed to sync. The lyrics and the songs are supposed to sync to the Wizard of Oz. Like I said, this author's never tried it, but I'll leave it to the person to give it a whirl and make up their own mind on it.
Yeah, it is fun, and you're right, that one moment, the Money moment, is probably the biggest. There's also a moment where in one of the songs it starts with a lot of bells, and that's the part where she's racing on the bicycle, and so that kind of makes sense. But of course there are lulls in the middle where you're like, I don't know, I'm waiting for that next moment, and then something hits you and you're like, it kind of works. So it is fun, and it is just weird how things in this world work out like that. But to switch gears a little bit to another series, we ended our last show talking a bit about the symbolism of James Bond and why the 007 number was chosen. But tell us about that again. I mean, it's been so long. Plus, you have a ton of new information to add to the James Bond pile too, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. The James Bond material is really interesting. I could talk about this for 5 hours, so I'm going to do my best to condense some of this. But you have the books written by Ian Fleming, who worked in intelligence during World War II for the British government during World War II. And Fleming was very influenced by the mystical and the occult. A lot of people aren't aware of this. This is coming out more and more, that during World War II and even during World War I, the great beast himself, 666, Aleister Crowley was a double agent for British intelligence. Believe it or not, Aleister Crowley, handler in British intelligence during World War II, was none other than Ian Fleming. So Fleming had this great occult influence upon him. And other people who moved in this circle was Dennis Wheatley, who wrote The Devil Rides Out. That features an Aleister Crowley character named Mokata, who summons the goat of Mendes and Baphomet in The Devil Rides Out. That was a movie made by Hammer Studios in the late 1960s. And also moving in the circle was Roald Dahl, author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Dahl actually incorporates some Hermetic themes in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And Dahl actually wrote the screenplay for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which was also written by Ian Fleming, who's obviously more well known for the James Bond work. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing with 007 is an esoteric reference to this Elizabethan magus named Dr. John Dee, who served as Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer, soothsayer. He prophesized her coronation date and said basically, Queen Elizabeth I, you get coronated on this date, you'll have this great golden reign. She listened to him, and she did, and it happened. And of course, Dee is known for creating, along with this guy named Edward Kelly, this system of conjuration known as Enochian magic, where one communicates with angels and demons. But Dee was involved with the spy ring under the aegis of Sir Francis Walsingham to basically protect Queen Elizabeth from extreme Roman Catholics in England, the Jesuits, and other people who worked in this spy ring would have been Dee, Kelly, Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, Giordano Bruno, the Dominican friar. They sort of formed this quasi-Rosicrucian style spy ring to prevent any sort of assassination attempts on Queen Elizabeth. It was sort of a security spy ring around her. And when Dee would correspond with her, he would sign the correspondence 007 or 007. And if you look at the sigil, it's eyeglasses. It's a pair of circles with a line over them and then a hash down the side, a line down the side. It looks like spyglasses. It's actually 007, and the symbol meant that the correspondence was for her eyes only, and that he was her eyes in the field. And of course, Fleming picks up on this, most likely, obviously, through Crowley, and this is why James Bond is 007 or 007. It's an esoteric reference to this early Elizabethan magician, astrologer, and spy master, Dr. John Dee. But you'll find very hermetic and kabbalistic and Rosicrucian themes in the James Bond movies, both in the books and the films. I mean, you have the alchemist, Auric Goldfinger, who wants to transmute the metal, the gold in Fort Knox. He wants to make it worthless and thus make his gold supply worth more. And of course, he's got his hermetic philosopher's stone there, the little nuclear dirty device, which he's going to detonate in Fort Knox to make that gold worthless and alchemically make his gold worth more money. And then you have, the whole concept with Bond. You have the alchemical wedding, the unification of the sun and moon, Bond being the sun, the moon being the Bond girl. They always unite. This equips Bond to go on and defeat the demiurge, like, villain, whether it be the alchemist, Auric Goldfinger, AU. Auric is the alchemical symbol for gold. That's another, gold reference or alchemical reference. Then you have the dragon, Hugo Drax, the voodoo master, Mr. Big, the illuminist, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who wants to take over the world. You have Bond, who gets the hermetic aid from the Hermes Trismegistus, like Wizard Q, who gets the, magical wisdom or the esoteric wisdom in the form of a gadget. And of course, the sun, being Bond, is set on the solar journey by M, and M is a solar reference. M is the 13th letter of the alphabet. So you have, the sun and the 12 houses of the zodiac being esoterically referenced with M, the letter M. That's very unique. And then, of course, the Bond girl, the sacred feminine, Sophia, divine wisdom. Her name is always overwrought with sexual innuendo. I'm not going to get into it. That's kind of well known. But you have the entire thing of the unification of the masculine and the feminine, what the Rosicrucians would refer to as the alchemical wedding, which always equips Bond with the, knowledge or gnosis, the unification, the oneness to go on and defeat the demiurge like supervillain. So you have this entire hermetical theme going on in the James Bond books and films. And again, you always have these over-the-top archetype villains, whether it be the alchemist, Goldfinger, the dragon, Hugo Drax, and again, the guy who wants to take over the world, the Illuminati type character, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Just a ton going on in the James Bond stuff. But yeah, the little hieroglyph for 007 that comes straight out of the world of John Dee. And there's some really interesting information going on with Dee and with this Aleister Crowley influence on Fleming. A lot of people aren't aware of this, that when Ian Fleming was working in British intelligence during the war, the Nazi number 2 man, Rudolf Hess, flew to England, and he was captured by British and thrown into the Tower of London. Hess was trying to fly. Hess actually cast his horoscope. If you don't know who Rudolf Hess was, he was basically Hitler's number 2 man in Nazi Germany. Hess didn't want a two-front war. He cast his horoscope and thought that he could broker peace with England, flew to Scotland, was captured, thrown into the Tower of London. And of course, it's no state secret that Hess was into the occult, astrology. A lot of the Nazi hierarchy was as well. So this is a true story. Aleister Crowley went to Ian Fleming and said, "Listen, let me try to, let me interview this guy. Let me interrogate Rudolf Hess. I'll perform some Goetia magic. I'll try to conjure some demons. We'll scare this guy half to death and try to get." This is a true story. He said, "We'll try to get Hess to talk about some of the Nazi proclivity towards astrology, find out some of their weaknesses, and we can use it against them." And Fleming thought enough of the idea to actually go to Winston Churchill with it. Churchill ultimately vetoed the idea, but you have this entire occult influence on Ian Fleming, and you could throw Dennis Wheatley and Ronald Dahl into that mix as well. And it's also coming out now that, and I'll just get into this briefly, that Crowley used to throw these parties where he would secretly mask the food with hallucinogens like LSD, mescaline, things like that. And this has always been chalked up to Crowley being Crowley, 666 being 666. This is just, the great beast being the great beast, right. More of his, occult monkey shines. This is actually being turned out. This is coming out now, this was actually the forerunner of MK Ultra, being done at the behest of Fleming and Winston Churchill to find out the effects of psychotronic drugs, things like LSD, on an unsuspecting populace. And Crowley seems to be the forerunner of this. Crowley would dope up a dinner party, take notes on it, find out what the reactions were. And again, this was being done at the behest of people like Winston Churchill, and again was the forerunner of MK Ultra. It's a fascinating study. The research on this is just coming out now. But Crowley was heavily involved with British intelligence, both during World War I and World War II. And during World War II, Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond stuff, was the guy who sort of oversaw Aleister Crowley's involvement in counterespionage during World War II.
Wow, man. I had no idea that these simple-seeming spy movies were just so deep beneath the surface. And I love the stories of Crowley and those references, and his connection to Ian Fleming is super interesting. Some of my favorite Crowley stories are these rituals to contact higher entities. It's pretty far out there. And I'm curious, have you ever participated in a type of contact ritual, being a 32nd degree Mason? Does this ever come up?
No, I've been asked this before. Have I ever done any sort of evocation or anything like that? No, I never have. I've never participated in it, but I am sort of the belief that I do believe there is something to this material. I do not believe that these rituals and these Enochian, evocations and Goetia-style rituals should be taken lightly. I do believe there is something to it. So I have always urged people not to participate in this unless they really know what they're doing or they really know what they're getting into. But I know, to answer your question, I've never participated in any sort of John Dee-like scrying ritual or evocation, Goetia magic, anything like that. But I'm not one to take it lightly. I do believe there is something to this material, and I've never participated in it, but I am very wary of it and would kind of admonish a person not to do it unless they really knew what they were doing. But no, Greg, I have never participated in anything like that.
I'm very curious, and I'm kind of like you. I feel like I should be pretty prepared if I was going to do something, because I just like to get that personal validation that there is something intelligent out there in a non-physical form that can communicate with you. But you got to be careful, because a lot of times the people who have made this contact talk about these entities' desire to deceive, and it gets pretty hairy. But I mean, I'd like to know there was something there, so someday maybe I'll put in the effort to get it all right and get all my ducks in a row and try to contact something.
Yeah, I've heard horror stories on this, and coming from people who, are not just people who are just making up stuff. I've heard stories of people who have tried to combine yoga with Royal Arch Masonry and wound up, invoking a demon. I've heard people who have tried, who get drunk on a Friday night, screw around with this material, and then the next thing you know, you've got some sort of Enochian demon hanging around.
Oh.
Yeah, not good, basically. And it's the sort of thing where I've never participated in anything like this. I don't think I really want to, but I generally admonish people not to try this stuff, not to take it lightly. If you are going to do it, my advice is make sure you damn well know what the hell it is you're doing, because this stuff can turn very dangerous very quickly, I'm told.
Wow, yeah, that's interesting that you've talked to some people that have had those negative experiences. Do you think there's anything positive to be gained from trying this kind of stuff? Because generally the attitude is almost always be careful, something bad can happen. Do you think anything good can happen?
Well, the idea behind this all is, and this goes back to like Renaissance Kabbalists and magicians who were invoking these entities. The idea behind it, whether you believe it's good or bad, is that if you're invoking these demons for wisdom, and even if you're invoking a demonic entity and you're invoking it to gain wisdom and insight, and that's okay. There's really no harm in that. The problem with this is some of these entities, they're very mercurial. You have to know what it is you're doing. They, like you said, they can trick you. You have to give these things a license to depart. Otherwise, they may want to stick around. And then, of course, you get the idea that, and this, of course, is the whole John Dee, Dr. Faustus story, that these guys are seeking wisdom for personal gain, which is a no-no. And again, this is the Dr. Faustus, who is John Dee, basically, is trying to gain insight to all the mysteries of the universe. The idea is that by invoking these demonic and angelic entities, people think, oh, well, it's an angel, so that's a good thing. If you read the works of these guys, the angelic beings can actually be more harmful than the demonic beings.
Damn.
Yeah, if you're going to invoke an angel, and especially, one of the archangels, these things are more deadly than the demons. The demons don't really mind talking to you because they kind of like the interaction. But, I mean, if you're invoking one of these godlike archangels, these basically things have better things to do with their time and kind of frown upon humanity. These things don't like humanity. This is a God's creation that these things can become very jealous of. So the demonic entity can actually be more beneficial than the archangel, who can be very vicious. So, you read stories about this, I guess there can be some benefits to it, but you read all the accounts, it always they always seem to wind up with bad effects and negative happenings.
Right.
And that always seems to be the case at any rate. So yeah, I kind of always admonish people not to do it.
Man, it's so interesting to me. I'm very, very curious. Getting back to the symbolism a little bit, what do you think the main reasons are for putting this in movies? Are these filmmakers just trying to pay tribute to the lodge, or are they trying to appeal to something in our subconscious, like a type of visual nicotine, maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I think it's a little bit of both. I think there is, for some of these directors, a bit of a chess game going on. I think they like to challenge you to see if you pick up on this arcana. I think embedding this, esoteric in mythology, it transforms the piece of celluloid, the movie, into this great mythological masterpiece. I do believe that. This is never more true with movies like Star Wars or The Matrix, things like that. You definitely delve into the idea of the collective unconscious of Carl Gustav Jung, where this material, this mythology, sorcery, magic, astrology, religion, is part of our collective unconscious. We're not aware of it. By these filmmakers sort of tapping into this unknown spring well of mythology, they're kind of hooking us with this material. That's certainly one way of looking at it. And I've been asked this before. Well, why would they do this? It's the best way for me to describe it. It's like an architect incorporating sacred geometry into a building. It's turning the building into a memory temple to stand the test of time. When you incorporate these astrological alignments into the building, you're symbolically drawing down divinity. It's the same sort of thing when you're incorporating this esoterica and this arcana into these movies. You're turning them into a piece of mythology almost. I mean, who the hell doesn't know, can't quote lines from things like Star Wars? I mean, if that isn't modern day mythology, I don't know what is. So you have going on, by my goodness gracious, Hollywood is literally printing money off this material. So you have this whole, you have multiple reasons why this is being done. It's like you said, it's almost spiritual nicotine. People, the collective unconscious can't get enough of it. You have it being incorporated to transform a piece of celluloid into a piece of sublime mythology. And then I also do believe some of these directors, especially guys like Darren Aronofsky, Stanley Kubrick, like to play a game of chess with the viewer, where to see, hey, can you pick up on can you pick up on what I'm incorporating into these movies? Because it's so adroitly done and it's so subtle. And believe you me, Greg, I have to watch these movies sometimes, multiple times to pick up on this stuff. I even tell the story real quick. I'm not going to get into the specifics. When I was doing the analysis of Black Swan in Cinema Symbolism, there's a whole alchemical take on that movie, which I excised out of Cinema Symbolism. I'm putting in Cinema Symbolism too. But when I was doing the alchemical portion, there was actually some symbology that went by me that I actually could have incorporated in Cinema Symbolism 1. But to make a long story short, Aronofsky snuck it by me. These filmmakers are very adroit, are very expert when it comes to incorporating this material. They know what they're doing. It's not by coincidence. And it's really turning a film into a mythological masterpiece, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, man, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I used to be inclined to think that there were negative reasons behind most of this. But, one of my recent guests, Jay Weidner, broke down the work of James Cameron and Christopher Nolan in a way that makes me think some of these directors are trying to spark a subtle reintroduction to Gnosticism and some of this enlightening information to the masses. Maybe they're trying to do this for positive reasons, not just to increase the legacy of the film and the success of the film, but maybe to enlighten the masses in a way that they don't get regularly. Do you think some of that's happening also?
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah. I mean, you have movies that are very Gnostic, not only eye-opening, but have awakening effects on people. Like the Matrix trilogy is one. I mean, the whole movie is about consciousness and becoming aware of a false surrounding and false circumstances. No question about it. It's the one thing. You look at it like this. You sit in a movie theater. It's a church. It's a church-like atmosphere where you receive light or enlightenment from undergoing this mystical journey on the big screen. You're presented with archetypes. This could be described as a religious experience to an extent, where you're in this church-like atmosphere receiving light. So yes, you can have movies that not only have Gnostic themes in them, but are in themselves trying to awaken you, trying to spark a divine spark in you. The Wizard of Oz is one. You watch movies like The Truman Show with Jim Carrey about awakening and becoming conscious and having epiphany. So yes, I mean, it's twofold. You have the subtle Gnostic themes going on, which are very embedded in the movies, but you can have the entire movie experience as an enlightening, sort of pseudo-religious experience. I definitely would not disagree with that. You go to church and you hear about Jesus. Well, in movies, you've got Jesus Christ. You've got the Christ archetype, the Savior, the Savior of mankind, Neo, who wants to wake mankind up from the evil machines. James Cole, JC, who wants to come back in time and save mankind from a deadly virus. Superman, who comes to Earth from his own, the only begotten son with magical occult powers to save mankind from itself, who resurrects the dead in Superman 1978, or resurrects Lois Lane from the dead. So yeah, I mean, you will find the Christ Savior archetype in theater all over the place. And again, it can parallel a religious experience. No question about it. I do not disagree with that take on it.
Well, I got an excuse now. Next time someone criticizes me for being lazy and distracted with TV and movies, I can just be like, "Hey, man, this is my enlightenment ritual. Okay, we've gone over this. It's clear as day."
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about think about a movie theater. I mean, you have aisles. I mean, it's laid out like a church, and you go to church or a synagogue and you hear about these biblical figures. Well, these figures can be astrological in nature, and again, this ties into the collective unconscious. And 12 Monkeys, James Cole, 12 Monkeys, 12 Houses of the Zodiac, James Cole, JC, Jesus Christ. The cinema is the religious experience. You may not be aware of it, but these filmmakers are. I assure you of that.
And you also talk a lot about horror movies in the book, and that makes a lot of sense because often the catalyst for the evil coming through is some type of ritual or some type of occult witchcraft or something similar to that. And we recently had a guest who claimed to commune with Baphomet himself, and it was very interesting. But I did want to ask you, knowing as much as you do about secret societies, have you seen a long history of contact with this specific entity coming up through the years?
No, I don't know. I wouldn't say anything like that. I know that the goat of Mendes or the Baphomet drawing sometimes gets Freemasons into trouble. The goat of Mendes drawing was drawn by a French transcendentalist named Eliphas Levi, and it's really more of a Gnostic icon than it is a dark emblem. It deals with a lot of themes relating to dualism, things like that. I do talk about the goat of Mendes in the Cinema Symbolism book in relation to witchcraft and werewolves in specific, because there's a tie-in with witchcraft and werewolves. But it gets Freemasonry into trouble because Levi was Freemason as well, but the works of Eliphas Levi, for lack of a better word, provide the raw material that Albert Pike used to draft Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite. So there's a nexus between Pike and Levi, and of course Levi draws the goat of Mendes, and it's Levi's works that Albert Pike actually plagiarizes in some points that actually become Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite. So it can get Freemasonry into trouble a little bit, but I always do point out to people that the Pike book, Morals and Dogma, is really a book more about comparative religion than it is about Freemasonry. But the goat of Mendes is an interesting drawing. It's very dualistic. It deals with a lot of themes of light and dark, good and evil. There's numerous ways to interpret it. Some people just see it as a demonic entity. I really don't see it that way, but I know it can freak people out, especially people who see it for the first time. But no, I know of no one or Freemason who has actually made contact with Baphomet at all in my lifetime, at any rate.
Right on. I mean, it makes sense. I was curious, and I didn't want to have an expert on without asking.
Sure.
I'm very interested in that contact thread lately. It's so outside of the normal scope of things that it's just weird. But man, I do love this stuff. And, you have a background that gives a new layer of context that I really do appreciate. I know I'm going to be getting a little bit of flack for being so friendly with this 32nd degree Mason. It happened a little bit last time. It happened when I had Lone Milo Duquette of the OTO on, but that's on me. And I really thought this was a fun show. When you're getting into large numbers in an audience, you're going to have little sections that are ultra paranoid about certain different things, and it happens.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, I don't hide that fact from anyone. I'm a Blue Lodge Freemason since 1997, amicable St. John's Lodge number 25 here in Baltimore. I became a 32nd of the Scottish Rite, Valley of Baltimore, Orient, and Maryland in 1999. I'm very proud of my Masonic membership, and I do not believe that the Royal Arch of Enoch or cinema symbolism would exist without me being a Freemason. So I have no problem with it, but if someone doesn't like it, it's the old line, Greg, I can't make everybody happy, so I wouldn't even try to.
I hear you, man. I struggle with that all the time. So I really do appreciate your work, man, and I appreciate you coming on. It's always a pleasure. Is there anything else you'd like to leave the people with before we call it in?
Why don't I just give out my website and how to buy my books, and we'll wrap up with that.
Absolutely.
Well, for starters, let me say thank you, Greg, for having me back on the Higher Side Chats. I thought it was a tremendous show. I really appreciate it, and maybe when Cinema Symbolism 2 comes out or something like that, we'll do a third time. I think I'd really like that, and maybe you'll have me on. I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. I thought it was a great show. If you're interested in my books, if you like the show, please check out me and my books. The easiest way to get them is through my website, which is www.robertwsullivaniv.com. That's www.robertwsullivan with 2 L's, iv.com. My name is Robert W. Sullivan IV. From my website, you can click on the banner from the homepage to buy my books. Signed copies of both books are available solely through my publisher. So if you want the signed paperbacks, I've been getting some emails. Where do I get the signed copy? Where do I get the signed copy? They are sold through my publisher. Go to my website, click the banner, and you can buy the signed copies. Alternatively, Cinema Symbolism and Royal Arch of Enoch are both in the ebook formats. They're on Amazon. They're on my publisher's webpage. They're on Barnes & Noble Nook. They're in the Apple iBookstore. If you like, if you're into the ebook and you want you're an e-reader, the books are substantial. The ebooks are substantially cheaper than the paperback. So, it's on the Amazon Kindle. It's on Nook. Just go to, again, www.robertwsullivaniv.com. There's links there to my Twitter feed, my YouTube channel. You can go listen to other podcasts I've done, Facebook fan pages, information about me, information, how to buy my books. Everything there is on my webpage, again, www.robertwsullivaniv.com. Check it out, buy the books, become a fan, follow me on Twitter, and just go watch some YouTube videos. And again, thank you, Greg, for having me on the Higher Side Chats. I really appreciate it, and I thought it was a tremendous show, and I look forward to returning.
Yeah, man, I thought it was a great